Hi everyone, this is John Sneisner, and today I have the pleasure to talk to my great friend Allison Pyburn again. And we're going into our special report. We did a special report on the student loan crisis and money and economics and the oncoming crisis that we're entering. So we're going to continue our thoughts on it. We're going to continue to talk a little bit about the numbers first, and then we're going to actually get into more of the meat and bones, which is what are we going to do about this crazy reset that has to come, that nobody seems to want to have happening, but like every time we postpone it, it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And so that we think that it needs to happen sooner than later. And of course, Allison has, her views on how it should happen. I have a little bit different views, but I think it's important that people hear all these thoughts about how we want to change, because it needs to change. There's no doubt about it. Like the system is completely destroyed, and it's we're up to that level where we have financialized our way to now. There's nothing left. What are we gonna start to put? Maybe we would put a title loan on our own bodies. Like, oh, I could give my one of my kidneys, like here's some collateral. Like, are we gonna go to that level before we start to understand like how in big trouble we are, with the current debt-based system? So let's dive a little bit into it. Let's maybe start about like let's talk about like current where we're at, because right now there's so much trouble in our, we got debt, but then on top of that there's another level of financial insanity called derivatives. And then so let's maybe talk a little bit about that, and then we're gonna go into the really good things. So don't fall off here. Like we gotta get into the actual solutions right away here. But I think it's important to talk a little bit about the current state of affairs and what we're seeing that is an oncoming reset that we could keep on trying to repair it, put some glue on here and doing this and that. But over time, that glue is going to just evaporate and just get destroyed. And then the whole, basically a crushed vase is just going to fall apart over time, right? So let's talk a little bit about like what do you see as of current and current issues and what we're seeing like is happening right now in front of our eyes in the financial system.
Yeah, and I think just from a starting point, one of the most important things to really own is that there is no difference between debt and derivative. And there is no difference between the fiat currency system and derivatives. The fiat currency is a derivative. And a derivative is something that derives value from something else. The derivative itself has no intrinsic value. So when we really let that sink in, I think that with the U.S. dollar, it may be 0.03. It's either like 0.03 or 0.3% backed by gold. There may be some assets thrown in there, but by and large, we're looking at a pure fiat currency. And when
Yeah.
we're looking at a fiat currency, when we're looking at a derivative, the important thing to really own and understand is that the only real value backing not only the US dollar, but all of the financial engineering with the US dollar, all of these crazy derivative instruments, the only resource backing all of that is human labor and everything you can literally touch and feel, everything that exists around you. We're talking about actual raw resources.
Yeah.
And so the best way I like to look at it and the way I like to describe it to people is just to look around. You and I talk about demographics a lot. We talk about, this system experiencing a demographic cliff, right? We talk about the ability and the willingness for people to continue in the patterns that they are in due to rates of disease and sheer exhaustion. And then we can look at our systems, we can look at our water systems, our soil, our air, the quality of our food, which we were also kind of laughing and talking about food itself being derivatized, being a
Yeah, very
derivative
much
food
so.
we have. So it's like, if that is the resource, that is the real resource backing all of this derivative uh, engineering that we're talking about, that is the real resource. If you look at the state of that resource, that is going to tell you of the real product of the economy, right? That is the real product of the economy. An economy is anything that orders energy into a value system. So you're looking at an equation, you're looking at a manner of being. And when that manner of being no longer either preserves or results in the flourishing of the resource that really matters, it needs to be changed and it will be changed. So that's kind of where we're at now in a very um, in a very real sense. In a very real sense.
Yeah, it's basically we reached the end of securitization, and you talked a bit about this in your other video that we did together. Actually, we've done two videos together, and you kind of talk about like with derivatives and with the structure of it, with the debt-based Ponzi scheme that we're running, you basically go from, like you start with the good debt, and then you just go up the like further out on the, the whatever what I call the credit score, and then suddenly you end up with the worst kind that nobody's ever going to pay back, but they need to do it because they started this Ponzi scheme of a derivative structure, and they got to keep on building onto it, and then you get a massive bubble and a crisis, which you had, and you've had several times throughout history. It's not just like in modern day American or Western history. Like this has been going on like far back, like since we started to create these structures. But in the current structure, you went to a point, and we've only like really have had certain sectors of like debt, these system parts of the whole debt-based structure that have gone away, that got too indebted and too much, indebted. But then at one point, like now we're at this point where everything like we're not like there's literally nothing left. Like the only we were looking at the actual numbers on derivatives and
Yeah.
they're going down, right? And that just shows us a collapse. And of course we were talking about the Federal Reserve running off their balance sheet, basically decreasing M2 money, the money supply itself. Like not let's not call it money, it's garbage, but it's the currency supply that is decreasing.
Yeah.
And so what that does in this Ponzi scheme, in a Ponzi scheme, you need constant, more people to participate at the bottom, and that's the debtors. The debtors are those participants that then pay off the huge pyramid all the way to the top with all these derivatives getting created. And so when you have less of that currency getting created, well, what's going to happen is you always need to pay. So when you create currency, you have the principal here, and then you have something called the interest. And when you create that, let's say it's $100, just for simple terms, right? So you have $100, and then you have the interest charge over here. Well, if I only created $100, how are we going to pay the interest on that, right? And so you need another loan to pay off that interest. And so you can see where it goes. And that's why like it indebts the sector all the way to the top until everything is completely indebted. And there's no way out of it other than basically just be like, hey, if there's one guy that sits without any debt, he's actually you're way better off having no debt at all, and you actually own things outright, like you own your own house, you own your own garden, and all this stuff. And so those people are going to be a lot better off. But the problem is we created these gigantic civilizations, and then we created these massive cities that are basically a lot of the cities were built upon this Ponzi scheme, with constant more debtors and financialization. And then you're sitting on a structure where we kind of disconnected from completely from nature, and so the toxicity of the system just starts to reach into different aspects of our life. Like look, since 1971 there's a perpendicular chart. I think I shared it. I don't know if I shared it in one of my books, but there's a chart going like this, which is basically the chart of the monetary system. Well, if you go and look at disease, you look at obesity, everything is basically following the growth of debt. like the debt-based system. And so what it does, and I wrote about this in my book, about anything that it touches, it really, like, what it does, it forces these entities in the system. And of course, we could talk about like the corporate structure itself, which is completely flawed. It makes a corporation a human, which, you know, makes it then suddenly completely separate from other humans. And so, like, you could, like, the corporation could go bust or could do whatever it wants, but it's not liable. Like, it's a corporation that's liable, not the individuals that are making these atrocities within those corporations. And so, but back to reality is that you're creating then these systems that are forced then to, oh, so how are we going to turn a faster profit, because they're destroying the value of our minimum exchange that we need to run a business. So, you know, let's come up with pharmaceutical products that makes you addicted to them. You know, like, look at the constant flow of new, like Oxycontin. You get all these like very bad fentanyl, all these products that are coming out of that system, because they're trying to create, you know, people that are more dependent on the system need to buy their pills or whatever it is on a faster basis for the corporation to survive, because the corporation is losing value. Like, it's funny with here in Canada, they're talking about, oh, it's corporate greed, you know, with their corporations, you know, profits have gone up. But actually, when I went and looked at the profits that have gone up, it actually didn't really go up. It's because of the inflation that have gone up. So, like, actually, the profit has gone down slightly, almost, like, it's, or stayed put. So it's like we're looking at the wrong thing here. We don't understand that the monetary system itself is the one destroying the value of everything. But then the government comes in, it's like, oh, we're gonna tax all these greedy corporations now. But then that takes even further value off of their books, and they're going to probably be pushed into doing even worse things, you know, and come up with worse products, you know, like when we went from, you know, building, I remember having, you know, fridge that my in-laws had here that was from the 60s. It was still operational. You know? And then, so now you're buying a fridge, you know, you're lucky to get, you know, 6 to 10 years on it. Right. So, but that was, again, in my view, it's a force upon that corporation to turn a faster profit, because they're getting destroyed by the monetary system itself, creating inflation and making their profits less and less worth. And so you got this like constant ongoing destruction that comes from the base layer of humanity, which is basically, you know, the medium that we transact with each other, with our, like, when we're busy, you know, creating value from the basis of our society, which is our commodities. Like, when you said work, right? Then commodities. Well, when you do work to create something out of these commodities, that's value adding to it, and that's actually real money. Like, real money is the labor, and then the value of whatever is there for, you know, the commodities. So with this system, like, now we're looking at, you know, the current data is like the only thing that's going up right now in issuance of these stupid derivatives are credit card loan derivatives. And so, like, basically they're now like, oh yeah, like, these poor buggers, you know, they don't have any money left now, so now they're going to go into their credit cards, which is, you know, 20 30% sometimes in interest, which is like just a death sentence in itself. And then so they get forced into those type of systems, where now also, like, oh yeah, let's securitize it and let's make a little bit of money there, some fees and some interest on those you know, bad policies. And so you could financialize a system, but you'll have like what happened in France with the Mississippi bubble, where you had basically everyone was buying shares, and then there was no shares available anymore. So what they did is, to bid up the price, is that they started to go into what was called margin loans. They started to borrow from banks and so on, then to then buy, you know, these assets at a higher price valuation, because now we carry more debt into the system, more and more house and yachts, to buy the shares of the Mississippi company, which was total fraud, by the way, by John Law. And what ends up happening is everybody just goes into it, and instead of the Lamborghinis that you see during the era of the Bitcoiners that did this, you know, massive bubble, you had horse and carriages was the big thing back then. And so all of them went into that, and they bought, more and more of these things around them, and it ended up in a huge bubble because there was nobody was able to get into more debt. They couldn't afford it more. And so that's kind of where we're at today. Like with any financialization, especially the Ponzi type debt-based and interest charging system that we have, you'll always get to that point. Like it sounds great, when you have the start of it, like when we start from a reset point of view that, it's like, now there's just like a little bit of debt here, that's going on. But over time, like it always ends bad. Like now we have literally like every institution is issuing their own debt. Like you have the non-bank entities that they're called that are issuing their own debt. So like it's totally wild. And now I heard like people are at the point where now it's like buy now pay later schemes. We're talking about, like, we're not just talking about big ticket items anymore. We're talking about food, for crying out loud. Food, and even going to Starbucks or something. Like they even have those schemes for the smallest minute things that we have, and it's and at like what, like 40-50% interest charged on it. So it's completely wild, Allison. But sorry for going on a huge rant there, but that's kind of what we're facing right now. And what do you see like is the next step of the face here? Like before we go into the big solutions here, what do you see as the next like kind of things that will end up happening here before we start to realize, the deep trouble that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, and I just wrote a big piece on all of the big numbers, and I feel like it's really alluring to get into, the precipitous climb of the stock market, to see the value, the huge valuation
The
gains there, because
value.
the value, yes, tremendous value. The valuation gains there in the U.S. stock market, to look
Yeah.
at, now we're actually seeing home sale prices come down. In fact, you had sent me that piece, not about residential home, but about a commercial building in Los Angeles. They're near or in Century City, that had a 43% drop in the
Yeah.
sale price from, what was it, 2017?
Yeah, 1870. Yeah, I don't remember.
2018.
But anyways, it's just a reality check that we're starting to get now, right?
We are, yeah. So we're starting to see fragility, I would say, in these asset prices. So it's alluring to look at all of these kind of big picture items. But the thing that I am called to look at and speak at right now is, what about the people that do not have, gold and silver? As we were talking about, what about the people that are living paycheck to paycheck, the ones who
Yeah.
are taking out what sounds like a loan to buy a coffee at Starbucks? What about this contingency of the population? And that leads me to look at a very, very interesting data point, which is that now, for every dollar of debt that the US government goes into, GDP is actually going down.
Yeah.
And that is, I believe that's the first time this has ever happened.
And it just shows you this is the last bit of the cycle, really, right? Like that's what you see with those numbers is you really like we tipped the, like we kind of tipped the we gone over the top, and it's only downhill from here. There's going to be a heck of a lot more debt creation, but it's not going to help anything. Like we're basically have gone over, too much debt, and the only way out of it is creating more debt, or else the system collapses. And they want to keep it alive because they want the power and everything that comes with that system. But they're going to fight an uphill battle that's they're never going to win in the first place.
Yeah, and this is where we get into the subject of entropy, because in my opinion, I imagine that the reason why GDP is declining with debt issuance now is that a lot of the debt issuance is funding social programs, right? It's funding, you know, people who are living paycheck to paycheck and still do not have enough. So
Yeah.
I know that in the U.S., the rate of people who are on food stamps is near or at an all-time high as well.
Yeah, it's
You know,
like 42 million.
yeah, it's very significant,
Yeah.
and it just, honestly, it breaks my heart. And I think about people who are struggling. When I think about children, how many children are on free and reduced lunch programs? What is the cost burden of keeping this system going from that standpoint? And when you look at that and you look at this real bleed out that's happening from the government, and then you look at the other piece, when you do look at the other pieces in comparison to that. So now the cost of new debt is very expensive, right? It's
Yeah.
expensive to keep the game going. It's
Yeah, and
expensive to
yeah, and what you're seeing, like let's look at Argentina right now. Like they'd gotten to a point where actually the young people in Argentina, we're not talking about the older generations that are in the current system. We're talking about the 30-year-olds, like from 18 to 30-year-olds. They were the ones that voted in a guy that said that we're gonna cut welfare, we're gonna cut government. Like that's how desperate they are of like figuring out what's going on, right?
yeah.
So, which is a good thing, by the way. Like it's good to not be dependent on anything, and then creating that system that you could be more independent of as individuals, but also then be dependent on everybody else around you, because it creates such a greater structure of strength in society. But like it to rip that band-aid off, like, are we going to go to the Argentina level where it's going to be 40 years of poverty and misery before
No.
we do this, right? Like, I don't want to be there. I want to thrive and I want to have a great life where I can do great things and, not having to live in poverty and misery because we're not willing to change. We're just gonna, oh, like let's just keep it going for a little bit longer. But what ends up happening is that poverty level is just going to keep on rising, and you're going to have just serfs at like a very soon. Well, actually, you have it right now. Like we really live in a feudalist system where you got the overlords, which is the rich politicians and the people that are closest to the debt creation, which can buy
Yeah.
with the newly created debt, they could buy assets and then grow their wealth. So you got the 0.01% that really are thriving on this system, but then everybody else is just getting poor and poor and poorer with every new debt that are issued, as you said.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're talking, it's interesting too, because I imagine when you say poor, we're talking about the depletion of perceived value of fiat currency, right? Or the purchasing power. But we're also getting poor in terms of in the US. I was also talking about we were talking about rates of obesity, we were
Oh,
talking about
100%.
rates of disease, just energetic depletion, right? And I was really curious, at what point is the amount of people, the amount of the population in the US that is actually invested, actively invested in the stock market, not through a pension, not through anything like 401k, these types of things, but the people who are actively involved, the people who are again holding gold and silver, that's a very small percentage of the population, right? Most of the people are actually they're either not working or doing something else, or they're trying to make it, right? So at what point I know you've studied this extensively, so at what point does that portion of the population pull away and say, this doesn't make sense to me anymore. I can't afford to feed my family, because my understanding is that usually happens when the cost of food is too high.
Yeah,
And
and so that's how you got the Arab Spring, for example. It started with the wheat prices going through the roof, which is the basic survival of most of the Arab countries, right? So, like it starts with that, and then it also goes into then with the distrust of the value of the actual medium of exchange that you're getting forced upon by these legal tender laws, by your local governments. Like look at just actually the other day. Turkey raised their minimum wage 49%.
wow.
Yeah, and it's because they destroyed their currency. And what's going to end up happening? You had Venezuela did this not too long ago, and they're actually ongoing on a second hyperinflation. But in Venezuela, what ended up happening is that highly paid government officials quit their jobs because they couldn't survive on a day-to-day basis buying food or anything. So you had a lady with super high paying government jobs. She actually quit and then she started selling coffee on the street and made 100 times more in that salary of what she actually like. It just shows you how the value changes when the currency goes bust. The value actually changes to real things. The real things are dead. Like we come into the understanding that all of these like derivative structures that we created that comes with this monetary system is basically worth less to nothing, really. Like the only real things that you have for backing in the system is really the real structures of houses and of course like all the resources that are around. But when you think about it, like I learned this at a very early stage in my life where well actually early I was 21, but in 2000 no it's 25 actually in 2008 I went to a conference of a Ponzi scheme. Enough. My dad got me involved in a multi-level marketing scheme, and so I went to Phoenix, Arizona, to attend this event that they had there. And what ended up happening was that the main speaker there, his name was Robert Kiyosaki, and he told everybody that your house is not an asset. But then meanwhile, he's been using the system by taking all this debt. He's one of those guys that are using the debt to buy assets. And so what he's showing is like, yeah, the system is fucked. Like you got to, but this is what you got to do to become rich in the system, right? So he's been writing that, but as soon as I heard that your house is not your asset, like I started thinking, and then actually you come to the conclusion that like the house over your head, you constantly got to repair it, fix it, and do all this kind of stuff. So it becomes more and more worthless over time, or it would just stay like this, or maybe you build onto your house, it becomes a tiny little bit more valuable, right? In what you have in your house, in real things, like the real things that you put into your house. Oh, there you go. And so you got this over time where uh, we then start to monetize these things, and then you go into this huge bubble. Like I just had my mom back home in Norway. She just retired, but in Norway, the taxes are so high and everybody's in so much debt that really like nobody can afford to, invest in anything or even put anything away. So you get a government, you know, like our form of social security or whatever. And if she didn't have another partner, like she would be basically living below the poverty line, getting the government, investment that she put money in all her life, and she's pissed off that she's basically getting nothing back for all the work that she put in, which she could have, instead of doing that, she could have invested it in doing productive things in her life with her labor and so on, and then accumulate a little bit of wealth that would be far greater than what she could have done when you get stolen from by massive taxation. Norway, it's like 36% is the base tax, for income tax. And then you got 25% VAT that's getting taken off. And so like the government steals all that, and then they have welfare programs which make everybody dependent on. And then basically when you make people depend on things, they don't become productive anymore. So they don't seek to, like do things for their own survival, and they're just sitting there like slaves in the system. And so it's like Norway is really on its path actually right now. Like you're starting to see a lot of things talking about how that I see warning signs that we're turning it, like Norway's turning into Venezuela. They had great riches, but then they financialized it all and they created a massive government that sucked the value and life force out of everything. And then so you then sit with, a worthless massive behemoth of a government, and then three times government no private debt to GDP. And so like there's nothing there. I talked to my mom, Norwegians are supposed to be some of the happiest people in the world, but really if you talk to the Norwegians, they're very depressed because they're stuck in that, they don't have a meaning of life anymore, a lot of them, because the monetary system has sucked the living life force out of them, and the whole system, with student loan, like all this stuff. It's just like the current system has just taken out all the energy, and basically transferred the energy over to those that are creating the currency into the system, and transfer that away from everybody else. And you just sit on that feudalist system where we have these overlords and we're just the peasants, living on their supposed land.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, how you put it, not the experience of it, but
Oh yeah.
that's exactly it brings me back to some of the comments you were making at the beginning of our conversation, which is that really with a valueless currency that is driving the majority of energy movements within a group of people, right? Because that's what an economy is. It's an organization of energy.
Yeah.
So when that organization of energy is really to siphon energy into that which has no value,
Yeah.
it's a whole derivative system, right?
Mhm.
And so one of my favorite things to talk about is, and I agree with you, we are kind of in the midst of a mental health crisis where people don't, we're not just talking about a monetary system, we're talking about an entire really moral compass, reason for being. Children are taught this system in school. That's what schools do. They feed children into these corporations and so on and
Yeah.
so forth. I mean, you could really go down a rabbit hole with that,
Yeah, that whole Persian Persian system, which is
but
completely completely obsolete in my opinion. Yeah, but that's for another time. It's
it's for another
in
time. But
itself.
one of my favorite topics
Yeah.
is that we are moving into a new value system. So it's like, what is that new value? And it's intrinsic value. It's intrinsic value. So it's really, to put it a bit more practically, it's a resource based, right? Not a resource based currency per se in a literal sense, but resource based value. So when you talk about houses and you talk about houses actually losing monetary value because of the cost of repairing them over time, we're going to be looking at what is the utilitarian resource of a house, what is the utilitarian resource of this commercial building, right? And how can we utilize it to serve the primary resource, which is the health of the planet and the health of humanity. So it's going to be this huge repositioning of what we even perceive to be value. And like we said in I believe it was the last conversation, we were talking about, I think, a massive retraining of people, those who have become hopeless, because intrinsically as human beings, we desire to generate energy within ourselves and to be of service to our own health and vitality and that of our families and one another, right? But when we can't do that, when we're limited to some sort of like debt creation as a profession, that doesn't really make sense for most people. It's really not a fit. So you end up with high rates of depression and again,
Yeah, you lose
pharmaceutical.
the meaning of the meaning of actually living.
Yeah, and so
So
it's gonna get just really epic. I mean, we're going to see this pairing of high technology with what really matters. Getting back to that fundamental resource at the base of all these derivatives, at the base of all these giant mosquitoes that are like just sucking the value out
yeah.
of what actually does exist, right? So it's pretty exciting. Um, it's a huge repositioning. It's a huge, huge, huge deal.
Well, yeah, there's no way out of it. Like anybody thinks
No.
that they could repair the system. You got politicians saying that oh, we just need to vote in these other guys. And then what you got to remember is they're just saying that oh, we could just do a little bit less of this instead of more of this. Right? So like we're basically caught in our own paradigm as human beings where we're not willing to because we're not, first of all, we're not taught that there could be anything else as a society that we could do, right? And so I think like what needs to happen is you need to just rip off the band-aids everywhere and let these systems just disappear. The high like the current educational system is completely unsustainable. It's not teaching anybody to do anything. I have a friend of mine down in Uruguay, and his son is actually like teach like self-teaching himself to go like he's like an EMR right now, like doing that, and then he's a farmhand, and he's like I think looked at some pilots like just things that are real and he's doing it without the schooling system in itself. Like you don't need the school like back in the day, there was no like I remember like so when I went to school there was an apprenticeship that I took for 2.5 years, well actually school part, and then another 2 years in being an apprentice in like in a business sense where I was fixing telecommunication systems and low voltage systems. But the guys that I got and started to work with, they got in before that time. There was no set educational standard back in the day. They were just taught, on work by everybody else. Like you had a mentor, and that person was an expert in their field, and they mentored others. And but what the current monitors is and everything did, it toxified the whole system. Where first of all, you need to go through like 12 years in the United States. No, so yeah, it's 12 years, right? Like grade 1 till 10. And then you
Yeah.
got preschool and all that. Like, so you need to go through all of that in order to then get to the other side of it. Which then okay, so oh, you should get a PhD in this. So now you're looking at like another 9, 10 years. And so you basically spend 20 years of your time, going and paying into the system, getting into a whole bunch of debt. And then for what? Okay, so what are you getting back in value? Unless you're a doctor, an engineer, or like some kind of healthcare worker, like what is really the point? Like you could go on and go to a farmer and be like, hey, I want to learn how to do this. And then the farmer will teach you how to do that, and you will help him, and he will probably, pay you or give you food and whatever you need. Um, but we've gotten to the point where we basically are like spending 20 years of our time, waste, our youth, like our whole youth, on, getting indoctrinated into a system that instead we could be, educating each other and helping each other. And you know, you don't need like probably 90%. Like in my schooling, I'm in a technological field, so 90% of what I learned, I didn't need in the first place. So I basically wasted a lot of time and money, in order to get something that I could probably have gotten by just being directly involved in that system from a younger age. Like I was doing child labor at age 13. My dad had me work in that field before I even went to school. So when I got out of this whole schooling part, I went to straight like salary because like I knew what I was doing. Uh, but nobody that went through that program knew what they were doing. But I knew it because I had like another year on them actually doing hands-on without the school into place. So uh, I think we're heading to the point where all these institutions, these centralized institutions that we build, even the centralized cities, uh, needs
Yeah.
to be really like what is ends up happening is it's just mass chaos in these big like this happens. I had a friend of mine, he passed away now, bless his soul, but he was a climatologist in Monterey and a climate historian, and he was
Mm.
going back and forth about how our climate always changes and all this stuff happens, but then we forget, how dependent we are on that we need food and water to survive. Like it seems like with this monetary-based system that we have, you get to a point it's like, oh shit, I gotta feed myself to survive. Like I've just been putting this stuff in my mouth and chewing it without understanding that it's a life force, that actually makes you into a healthier, not human being. Like we have those basic needs. Like that's it. Like even shelter you could, find anywhere. Like if you wanted to live out in the bush or whatever. But like the main two things that a human need is like, and I went to military for a year and I had survival training. You really find out what you need, like your
Yeah.
basic resources at that time. It's like, yeah, I'm freaking hungry and I need water to survive. And that's it. Like that's all you really need as the base. And then what you create otherwise, like uh, human beings are different, right? Like there's some of us that want to do more and produce more, and they create more value than others, and that's totally fine in my opinion. That people want to do that. They want like I'm not against, in the new system that you have business, for example, but you cannot have the current like system of a corporation where there's nobody that's liable for their actions. If they were liable for their actions, all the drug deaths that are out there, and the obesity that are out there, they would have to be liable for that. And they'd be bankrupt most likely because people is like, hey, well, what's going on there? Like people are dying from your food. You got to stop that. But then they have regulation and a monopoly that they created with the huge state structure. that then basically inhibits anybody to compete with them, providing a 10,000 times better product. And then if you had a real market there, you would actually have people be like, oh, this is really good. I would have that instead of this garbage. And so then you could turn around pretty quickly. And then instead of this garbage stuff that's out there, you'd be able to nourish yourself and be more healthy. And there's an interesting, I have a friend of mine that used to be at the World Bank. And this is an interesting take on, like big government and then a private entity taking care of something. This was during a civil war in Africa somewhere. I forgot the country, but what ended up happening was the government had a forest and they completely destroyed that forest. But beside that forest, it was a privately owned by all kinds of different people, and it was like a pristine, well taken care of, forest. And it was private. Some were businesses, some were individuals, and all this stuff, right? But he was then told by the World Bank, is like, well, he's like, that's a very bad idea. Look at how well these people are taking care of itself because they're accountable, to themselves to make sure that their nature is like that. They actually take care of their environment. And the World Bank said, like, well, that's a terrible idea. We want the government to own it down there. So they wanted to fund the buying and takeover of that land. And so he said, like, I'm not doing it. So he lost his job. But again, it shows like if you have people that are actually accountable to themselves, it's a lot easier. And you don't have that structure of government that could then, like in today's structure, what do you be called regulation? It's really impeding. It's actually stopping, the health of our earth and of water and everything, because it's been taken over by these entities that are then corrupted by the monetary system on top of it. So I don't know, like I know that's a lot for me, but like that's kind of like what I'm thinking about this system. And you know, we just got to give up on wanting these centralized top-down structures and instead looking at, real type of decentralized structures of how we deal with each other as human beings. Because we always seem to be like getting caught up in our old ways where we're like, oh, we need a leader, and that leader is going to lead us, to somewhere. It's like, yeah, you got the productive people around that will do that. But again, if you let them get too much power, that we every single time we create these governance structures, we always do. We always give them, oh, it's like, oh, you can do this now, you can do that now. And then they get too much power and too much, and then be like, oh, hey, let's create this currency that we could create out of thin air. And then basically you created a recipe for disaster yet again. And it seems like that's where we're at, where uh, we were at the end game of the current system again. It's not the first time throughout history. Like it's not like be like, oh, this is the first time it's ever happened to us, but it's actually the first time that almost every nation state on the globe is in similar spot than everybody else. Like we really pushed ourselves into this system, and as you said, I don't know if we talked about this in our recorded video. We talked about it before, but you were saying that the current, U.S. dollar-based system has to go and eat up more and more countries. It's like join our system, and they need then to, oh, let's create more debt over there so we can keep the system going. Like, but what are you gonna do? Like the whole globe is indebted. It's like, should we find an alien civilization and then try to indebt them? Maybe like we're kind of, we haven't found anybody yet, so we're kind of in deep trouble.
Right.
Anyways,
Yeah. It's you reach an end point, where the resources, right, where
yeah,
the health and vitality of the resources can no longer fulfill the minimum debt payment, right? That minimum debt payment becomes very expensive no matter which way you look at it. And I really resonate with what you said about self accountability, right? And people become accountable to and thus vulnerable to a system of knowledge that has been taught as truth, but the real truth and what we're coming into is in alignment with self accountability. It's remembering the wisdom of nature. It's remembering that actually every human being that is born is intrinsically valuable. This whole value system that has been placed on humanity has led people to enter into college, as you also spoke of. They enter into college for what, some kind of 20, 23, 22 years schooling overall. And
Yep.
then plus, as you said, if someone's pursuing a doctorate degree or a
Yep.
master's degree. So if someone is doing that, in order to be valuable by the paradigm, valuable per the paradigm of religion, of this economic system, they're going to end up very depressed because they would have spent all of these years of schooling to be in a job that appears to be economically viable. Now, whether it's even economically viable by the time they graduate is another story. We end up with inflation of entire sectors of careers, like
Yep.
lawyers, right? All this inflation of these people. So they don't end up making the amount of money that they thought they would, or currency that they thought they would.
No,
And
exactly. Yeah.
and then sometimes they even do make that amount, but that's not the happiness, and then they're depressed and they feel empty. And so it's really getting back to this natural system of, well, every human being that is born is valuable, and how do we nurture that value of every being that's here? How do we nurture that value? And how do we nurture the land? These are the things, these are the fundamentals that we get to come back to now. Anytime, as you said, anytime that you have an overlay, anytime that you have an overlay created by man of what should be, how someone should be, how someone should dress, how someone should behave, how someone should quote unquote earn fiat currency, right? You're going to end up with high rates of disease, depression, quite a bit of malaise, because again, you are extracting that which is real into a false man-made system of rules, which by the way are constantly shifting.
Yep.
Those rules those rules have to constantly shift, otherwise they lose momentum, so they've
Yep.
got to always shift and change. So it really is beautiful, and I feel that self-responsibility, looking inward and determining, well, what do I really enjoy doing? Maybe I do enjoy selling coffee. Maybe I do enjoy selling coffee on the side of the road way more than working in this very
Cubicle.
remote structure cubicle, right? Maybe I do enjoy that more, and then there I'm making more currency. So I guess, or whatever. But just what really brings that joy and happiness, and I do feel that, again, we talked about the ability to buy food and just survive, but also we're looking at survival from the perspective of joy, like inherent joy within individuals. Because when people are depressed for this long and they're just really not seeing the value in the American dream as it's been sold, like was it, I think Green Day just came out. I was going to tell you, Green Day came out with this song, I think called something American Dream, but it's really well done, and it just crystallizes how so many are feeling, not just in the United States, but all.
The American dream was a debt-based dream.
Yeah, it's a debt-based dream. And
Yeah.
like, you can one day, one day you will find happiness. Not today. Today you're
Yeah.
working, but one day you'll find that happiness, right? And so
Well, I think if you have like a underlying system where people just take care of each other, and if you actually like
yeah,
start to understand that, it was like, well, you know, if you could teach kids at a very young age to try to find those things that they value, because when we're born with like, at least for my research, we're born as like we're all completely different. There's not one single individual on Earth that are really 100% similar. There's some of us that you get born like I have a group of people that are anarcho-capitalists, but they were kind of like, and all of them had like that part that they didn't like big government or anything like that, or authority over them, and so they want to be free individual beings. And so they find out like later on that, oh, there's this thing that we could just be free and do what we really love to do instead. And so I think if you could teach kids at a very early stage, and I think it's going to be problematic to try to push these ideas on every single human being. I don't think everybody wants to accept them. That's why I'm also like a voluntarist, which basically voluntarism means that if you want your system, go ahead. Like if you want your fiat-based system, I'm not going to participate in that anymore. I want my own system over here that I think it's more valid to me. You can have all kinds of systems, and we could only freely interact with each other in different types of ways that are beneficial to each other. But we can't use, any force. Oh, it's like, oh, everybody has to do this or nothing. It's not going to work, unfortunately, as human beings. But what is going to work is that people, get to choose and find what they really like in life, and then find places that kind of you are accepted, and people will levitate towards that more. And you just need to, like, if you could get to a system where you value every single human being that gets born, and then actually, and it, like, people always wants to go back to centralization. What if it was actually the parents, that was in charge of their kids and not the state, that you have in the current system? What if they were in charge of like raising somebody? They'd probably be pretty responsible, with the way they try to raise their kids, because they want to make them into successful and happy human beings. And so, like, but that's with a system that is not like, you're not getting born into indebtedness. Like now, like in Canada, like this is ridiculous in Canada. Like now they're going into what Japan went in the 80s, where you have up to like 80, 90-year term mortgages. Like you literally have to have your kids sign on to this. Like, oh, you were born into debt. Sorry for you born into this family, but you're born into this debt forever. You're stuck in this system. And so when you get forced into these, and it's the same thing, get born into, let's say, Norway or in Canada or in France or in Zimbabwe, wherever you are in the world, you get born into this nation state, and this nation state's telling you need to behave this certain way and participate in the system, or else you're going to end up in prison. It's like if you don't pay your taxes, you could end up in prison, for example, if you don't want to participate in the system, right? So you get these entities that forces themselves upon you instead of like letting you as a free, like I believe when everybody's born, we're born free. Like there's nobody really that like government exists only from our creation. Like when we're born, we're free individual human beings on this planet, and there's nothing that should then tell us what to do. We should figure that out ourselves. Of course, when you get born, you usually have parents around that could help you, along that way. But when they're not forced into a indoctrinated state that they're in, things will become a lot better. It's like people from North Korea, like there was a girl that was talking about North Korea, and they literally had to eat bugs to survive. These little cute little girls, and then they had to travel for miles to try to find a better place to live than within the forced borders. And so they went through just the most horrific stories that anybody could go through with, they were human trafficked and raped and all this stuff until they found a place that they liked more. But then they found that there they were going through the same cycle, like but they were just further away from the totalitarian cycle. And so they were like, well, I moved all the way throughout Earth, went through all this hardship, almost got frostbite, raped, and all this stuff. And then I come to this other place, which they're just on their way to the same system that I had, that fled away from. So I think we need to get to that point where um, we need to be able to choose what we want to do with our lives. And I think your system is one of the ways to get there is you need to be able to adapt to the current ways, which is not going to be the system that we have. It just shows throughout history that we destroy everything with it. And so, if you want to talk a little bit more about what you think is a better way, and I know we're going to go more deeply into the system, but just to give kind of people a little bit of a prelim into what you believe is a good type of system that you would like to see in your life, and others that might agree with you.
Yeah, well, I feel like it's choice, right? But the thing is that we can't wait for someone to give us that choice. We can't wait for some sort of savior.
No, yeah,
And I
exactly.
think that that's actually baked in to this current system. I feel that is that the savior dynamic is intrinsically baked into the entire system that we've been talking about. Whether that savior is, when you graduate from this next year of college, you're going to make this amount of money, therefore this amount of fiat currency, or currency, pardon me, but this amount of fiat currency is going to be your savior. This other thing is your savior. Or now, people are talking about, well, when is the system going to end? We've been talking about that. Will that debt default? Will that default payment be the, or lack of payment, be the savior, right? When is that savior coming? And the reality is self-responsibility. The savior is ourselves.
Yeah.
We are those saviors. And so that is the, there, in my, from my perspective, that is the new, if there were a new system, that's it. It's self-responsibility, no matter what we choose to participate in. As you
Yeah.
said, it's, if there's a system out there that's working well, and you can see the tangible benefits that it is actually working well, and it brings you fulfillment, there's no problem. But what we're moving into as a species, and really as a planet, is this new experience of self-responsibility, right? So we have got to be the ones that are responsible for our own happiness, our own fulfillment, how we nourish ourselves at every level. And we can't, those people who are sitting in cubicles, and that is very stressful, to be in a cubicle, to be in a locked into a cycle where it feels like you can't get out. But there is always an out. There's always an out. And what I see in the amount of time that I've spent crunching all the numbers, looking at the system, when that system falls is when participation falls, right?
Oh, 100%. We're the
That's
ones
when we
keeping it
look at,
alive. 100%.
right, it's like we look at the velocity of money, right? We
Yeah.
look at the plummeting velocity of money in conjunction with the reduction in the M2 currency supply. Well,
Yeah.
what that sounds really maybe abstract, but what that actually is more people not participating
Yeah.
for one reason or another. So it's like, okay, so we're not going to participate, and then we're going to create new systems that work. So maybe one person over here is like, hey, this is what I'm doing with my property, this is what I'm growing, maybe we could trade between us. You've got chickens, I've got a goat, I've got goat cheese, goat milk, or whatever. What can we work out between us? And you're going to, in my opinion, you're going to start to see these microeconomies beginning to form, where you're going to see networks of like-minded people, like-intentioned people that are interested in creating their own microcurrency, I guess, microeconomy,
Yeah.
because it works for them, right? And it's going to be arranged, but ultimately the one truth, the one trajectory that we're moving toward as a species is that self-responsibility at every level. That's why rates of attendance at churches they also must be all-time low. They have not bounced back from COVID.
Well,
And
yeah, and they kind of like have
so,
central, like again, they're facing the same problem. They centralize, power instead of people, that are religious, believing that God is everywhere. It's like, no, the central entities where you need to worship, and you can only do it here. And there's a leader, that tells you what to do, and you got to participate like 5-10% of whatever you produce to this central entity to keep it alive, instead of being like, hey, I could pray to God whenever I want. I'm a free human being. So like
yeah,
it's like that. We as humans always like to create these central entities, and there's certain aspects of humans that likes to go towards us, like, hey, I'm a leader over here. I got a great idea of a central system that I want to create, and so we always tend to like move towards that, and never get taught to little kids that maybe like it's not needed to have these central entities anymore. But it's a structure that maybe it's kind of an awakening that is happening, where people are figuring out, it's like, hey, like this system that we have a tribe with a leader, that we had for 200,000 years that humans have been in existence. It's like, maybe that's, maybe we're better off just being our own leaders. And if you could help, kids awake to that idea that maybe are we entering, Allison? the renaissance of us, uh, recreating the very structure of humanity itself, but like the top-down type of hierarchy. Like, are we figuring out that maybe it's better? But again, there's been ideas like this that have survived throughout history. Like, I just interviewed a lawyer from Norway that was talking about how the Vikings, before the kingdom of Vikings started, there was, in central Norway, there was local farmers and communities that worked together without problems. And if one of them became tyrannical, you could either kill them or chase them out. Like if they started to take and steal from others, right? So like they worked together for a very long time, these decentralized system, and they were totally fine. They survived and they were able to trade with each other, do whatever they wanted because it was voluntary interactions with each other. Um, I think like unless we get to that point, like there's no way of actually trying to fix the system. Sorry, I've just been looking at my phone. I had a funny thing. It sums kind of up 4,000 years of medicine here, and it says 2000 BC. Here is a here's a root. Eat it. And then it goes through the history. Like this is just kind of funny thing. It says like that root is heathen. Here say this prayer. And then 1865 it says the prayer is suspension. Here, drink this potion. That potion is snake oil. Here, swallow this pill. Take that pill. It's ineffective. Here's an antibiotic for it. That antibiotic is poison. It's not working. Oh, here's the root. Eat it. So we're like, it's just a funny meme of saying that we're actually like going back towards, the origins of and starting to understand finally again that we're human beings and we just have basic needs that doesn't have to be created and derivatized and made cheaper and all this stuff. Like everything is out there that we need. And we need to get back kind of more towards that, or else we're going to just suffer the utter defeat of a collapse of society and end up in a global world war if we don't turn around and let the system fail. Because if we continue down, the next 10, 15 years, believe me, like there's going to be a lot of death and destruction. And the government of Canada, like let me just tell you what the government of Canada is having as a solution. All this misery, all this depression and everything. Well, it's like, oh, let's create something called MAID, assisted suicide, and then let's just move it a little bit. There was a lady that was had a lot of pain, and she was a veteran, like she got hurt and fighting a stupid battle overseas, and she's like, I have all this pain. I need some help with it. Instead of going and looking at, ways of treating that, fixing that, like the government comes out, is like, how about you just kill yourself? Here's a good idea. And then now they're expanding it to mental illness and to everybody else, because what greater way of getting rid of mental illness is not trying to fix it, not trying to make people happier, just kill yourself. Like then the problem is gone. That's where we're going. If you want to have this stupid monitor system that we built, we're going to end up and facing like a lot of death and destruction. And it needs to change. There's no doubt about it. And it has to change. But until that time that we're willing to do that, we're going to get a lot more death and a lot of more destruction and a lot of misery unless we actually be like, hey, this is very stupid what we've been doing for the last, actually for a very long time. And let's look at other options here that are more valid. Like it sounds like, oh, that's the death of society and everything. It's like, no, it's not. Like we still have technology. Like that's exactly what you talked about. Like we now have technology that is so great that these decentralized structures of self-reliance and everything that we can create is 100% viable, and we could still live as a functioning society worldwide. We don't like
Absolutely.
people are so afraid of that disappearing. Oh, we got to go back to the Stone Age and be farmers. It's like, no, that's not exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about a very well-functioning society with the thing is, we'll probably go back to understanding that, oh, let's produce things that create value for everybody else instead of, creating these debt and derivative based systems that comes with, a flawed operating system that we use as as human beings in between each other.
Yeah, and with that, I am about to get massively interrupted, so we're gonna have to continue this conversation next time. But there is so much to say about all of that, but ultimately it's self-responsibility, right? And this depression, this disease, that's horrible. That's horrible. It's heartbreaking. And there is always another option. And ultimately, yes, we're gonna have new systems. We're gonna have new systems. I don't see there being overlords. Maybe in some realities, yeah, but ultimately what we're gonna be doing is probably utilizing technology in order to connect all of the unique skill sets that humanity is naturally born with, right? Like every human nature is our intelligence. We already have this beautiful intelligence, right? So there is no being that is born that is just meant to be killed. We are an incredible species living on an incredible earth. So there is always a way. There is always a way. We will be supported. Fear is not real. We will be supported walking away from that which does not serve us. And technology is going to absolutely boom. And I hope and I see that technology will again link together all of our intelligence in a way that empowers us to thrive, right?
No, 100%, and that's where we're heading towards, and look forward to our next episode where we're going to go deeply into this. But it was great having you on, Allison, again, and always looking forward to our conversations. Now, is there anywhere where people could find more about what you're talking about and following you?
Yes, we can put a link to my Substack. I write all kinds of things on there. I just wrote this big article before the holidays I've been working on for a long time. And if you really want to get into all the numbers, they are there. And then I have a lot of stories and other things on there too. So
awesome. Well, looking forward to have you back on again, and we'll talk soon.